Hi all, today we are discussing Aristotle. Aristotle is a classical literary critic, classical scholar. Aristotle, Plato and Aristotle are the two great classical scholars. They have laid the foundation for literary criticism. The discipline called literary criticism has been established by the scholars Plato and Aristotle, and more than Plato, Aristotle was the scholar, the philosopher who wrote the first text of literary criticism, first work of literary criticism titled as Poetics. So, as the author of Poetics, the first work of literary criticism, Aristotle is known as the father of or he is known as the scholar, the critic who laid the foundation for this literary criticism. Aristotle lived in this age, was born in 384 BC and died in 322 BC, and he was a student of Plato. He studied 20 years under Plato, and he was the teacher of Alexander the Great, the son of Philip of Macedon. So, Aristotle is known as the student of Plato and the teacher of Alexander the great emperor, and he had established an academy. His academy was really known as Lyceum in Athens, and as I mentioned, he was the first thinker to produce a work of literary criticism, Poetics, the work which influenced theorizing about literature, that laid the foundation for Western literary criticism. And unlike Plato, Aristotle focused on eternal ideas and natural is but a reflection or copy. Plato always believed that eternal ideas are the ultimate realities and natural world is a reflection or a copy of this world, and the writers who write literature are real impersonators, or they are not producing anything original, but they are impersonators. This is what Plato believed. But Aristotle, the thinking of Aristotle was really something that focuses on the reality to be discerned in individual things. In this individual, in this world, the realities of the individual world, that was really realities of this world, that is really what Aristotle focused on. He was really not believing in any eternal ideas beyond this world, beyond the world of realities, but he focused on this world, and he had a bent of mind, scientific bent of mind. He was logical and rational, and he was endowing this natural phenomena with a validity. And we know that entirely opposite to his teacher Plato, Aristotle always believed that the reality is to be discerned here, and he never believed in the ideal that is remaining beyond the world of the realities as Plato conceived. Plato was really concerned with the theory of education and the curricular impact of imaginative literature on growing minds. Plato was really concerned with the theory of education because he has always been concerned of the moral, ethical aspects of the society, and he has been examining the role of poetry, role of literature in general in making man civilized, in making man an ethical and moral being, and whether literature contributes towards the making of a better man, making of a better society. And this educational purpose, educational notion was really something very important for Plato. But Aristotle was really never thinking like that. Imaginative literature to Aristotle was really not at all a thing to make society or individual better. So, that means the moral and ethical concerns were really not that much important for Aristotle, but he was Aristotle was concerned to analyze the nature of imaginative literature in itself and not as an educational tool. And Aristotle was really trying to examine the nature of imaginative literature, and he was never thinking of using it as an educational tool. Plato, unlike Aristotle, was using it as an educational tool, and he was trying to examine whether it can improve the individuals and society. And he examined the nature and characteristics of imaginative literature that Plato shunned as useless and false. Plato had found imaginative literature as something useless and false. He has shunned imaginative literature as something useless in making individuals and societies a better one. But Aristotle was really never doing that. Instead, Aristotle focused on the structure of imaginative literature. He made extensive studies on it, on various aspects of it, various characteristic features of it, and he had theorized everything. And Poetics is really a text that theorizes imaginative literature. as I mentioned earlier. But Plato was really kicking poets out of his ideal republic, because Plato believed that poets cannot elevate the status of the society regarding its ethical, moral principles and values especially. And when we move on to poetics, I told you the first literary text, text of literary criticism written by a classical scholar, Aristotle. It was composed around 330 BC, and it was a treatise of about 50 pages containing 26 small chapters. It was a slender text, slender volume having 15 pages only, containing 26 small chapters. And actually the text Poetics is a summary of the lectures delivered by Aristotle to his students. And the second part of the text is believed to be seemed to have been lost, and there is a notion that the second part it had, and it was found lost. So it's an incomplete text, and it omits some important questions also, especially discussions of comedy and catharsis are really seemed to be omitted out of it, in the sense that Aristotle is not answering some important questions regarding comedy and catharsis. Tragedies and comedies were two important literary forms of the period in which Aristotle lived, and we had great writers there in ancient classical tradition. We have great writers like Aristophanes, Sophocles, etc. But there are some important questions regarding comedy seemed to have omitted by Aristotle, and catharsis made a mentioning about catharsis, an important idea contributed by Aristotle, but catharsis or purgation, that is not expanded or explained in detail by Aristotle in it. And the first 4 chapters and the 25th chapter of Poetics are really devoted to poetry, seem to have devoted to poetry. And the 5th chapter is in a general way, it's about comedy, epic and tragedy. And the 14 chapters in it, 14 chapters are exclusively spent for tragedy. So tragedy was a literary form in vogue during the time of Aristotle, and next 2 chapters are on epic poetry, and the last is a comparison of epic poetry and tragedy. This is the structure of the text Poetics, the first text of literary criticism written in classical tradition. Unlike Plato, Aristotle was less bothered about the moralistic uses of poetic art, because Plato always believed that poetry should have a use. It must have some basic principles that should help to elevate the status of the individual in the society. But Aristotle never believed, as I mentioned earlier, never believed any such things, but he was a rationalist, fascinated by the act of categorizing and creating a system out of which out of what he saw as popular creative endeavors of his time, means the popular creative attempts, enterprises of the time, means tragedies and comedies written during the time of Aristotle. He was really trying to make some kind of a categorization or trying to make a system about that, creating a system. That was really what he was always interested in. And he had a great respect for great writers, like especially Homer, the great writer of Iliad, the author of Iliad and Odyssey, Sophocles, a great writer of tragedies. He had a great respect, admiration towards these writers who lived during his time. His main concern was tragedy. As I told you, 14 chapters of Poetics was actually spent for detailing about tragedy, different aspects of tragedy, elements of tragedy, and definitions of each element, etc. But we can say that his concern was always tragedy, the literary form. Tragedy is really considered by Aristotle as the most developed form of poetry. And in Poetics, Aristotle presents poetry as an art of imitation or mimesis. In Poetics, Aristotle says that poetry is an art of imitation or mimesis, and all art is, unlike Plato, he believed that poetry is an art of imitation and all art is mimetic, and Plato also believed that in that concept. Objects of imitation, according to Aristotle, are men doing or experiencing something, and this is one of the cardinal differences between Aristotle and Plato. Plato always believed that it's an act of imitation, but there is an ideal thing that is being imitated. The world is an imitation of that ideal concept, and literature is an imitation of this world. there we are really much further and further taken away from the reality. That is what Plato believed, but Aristotle was really believing in this concept, men imitation, but poetry is an art of imitation, but imitation are objects of imitation are men doing or experiencing something. And Aristotle classified different kinds of poetry according to the kind of people that it represents. He made two categorizations according to the kind of people who are represented in literature, in poetry. Tragedy, the explanation given by Aristotle to tragedy is that a poet could represent the life of grand characters in grandiose manner. If the characters represented in a poetry, in a poem, if they are grand characters just like kings, queens, etc., and if they are really presented in a grandiose manner, it will be a tragedy, or tragedy must have that particular feature. And comedy means characters are really selected, picked. Ordinary and simple characters are picked and they are really represented in an ironical and humorous way. That is what comedy is according to Aristotle. So that categorization or that definition has been given to tragedy and comedy by Aristotle. We see that he makes a distinction between three modes of literary representation. Then he speaks about three modes of literary representation. Then one is a blend of narrative, three ways in which literary representation is done according to Aristotle. One is a blend of narrative and dialogue, speaking in his own voice and in the voice of his characters, in the voice of the characters and in the voice of the poet. That is one mode of narration. Second one, a sustained utterance by the single voice of the poet. The utterance will be that of the poet only. And the third one is the utterance will be through the characters only. So, the first one is a blend of poet and characters, second one is that of the poet only, and the third one is that of the characters only. And this was the basis of categorizing literature into different genres. Aristotle identifies thus the medium, considers the subject matter, and analyzes the technique used for literary representation. As he has detailed all these basic aspects or elements of literature, we can call him as the founder of literary criticism, or he laid the foundation of Western literary criticism. Yeah, with that I would like to wind up this short session on Aristotle. Thank you.